Welcome to the World Class Speaking podcast series. This is a place where you will learn how to present, persuade, and profit by improving your communication skills. Each episode in the series is a chapter from the book World Class Speaking in Action. And each chapter is written by a certified world class speaking coach. I'm your host, Matt Miller, and I've carefully crafted and summarized each chapter in the book. Have you ever been part of a question and answer session or Q&A session and it was very unproductive? Or maybe the audience asked unfair questions. Or maybe the speaker didn't know how to respond to a question that you thought that they should have been able to answer. Or maybe it got out of control and derailed the whole presentation. In this episode, you will learn where to put the Q&A in your speech and how to make the best use of the Q&A as a whole. It is Mastering the Question and Answer, or Q&A, and it is by Del Self. And Del Self wrote this chapter in the book, World Class Speaking in Action. And Del Self is a certified world class speaking coach, as well as an author and professional communicator. Mastering the Q&A portion of your presentation is super important because a poorly executed Q&A can ruin your message, leaving your audience with nothing but questions. Similar to how the housing market is all about location, 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 the question and answer is also all about location. Just as the right house in the wrong location can diminish the value of a house, the Q&A in the wrong location can diminish the value of your speech. Do not put the question and answer as the very last thing in your speech. Here's why. Your last words linger. If you put the Q&A at the very last part of your speech and it ends up going poorly, let's say you have somebody in the audience that asks you an unfair question and you cannot give an answer to it, or things get out of control, or things last way too long, or it's super boring and unproductive, that is what the audience is going to remember. So it's important that you have a Q&A, but don't make it your very last thing. Put the Q&A directly before the closing. If done right, a Q&A can enhance your message. When it comes to a Q&A, this would be an appropriate way to address it. Let's say about halfway through your speech, you say, now I want you guys to all think of questions because I'm going to be opening it up for a question and answer towards the close. So you plant the seed there, and that gives the audience time to think about questions that they're going to want to ask instead of them being super reactive by mentioning it and having them ask spontaneous questions. That's the first thing. You plant the seed earlier in the speech. And then when it comes time for the Q&A, you want to say something along the lines like this. Now I'm going to open it up for questions. We only have 5 minutes, and then I'm going to close with a powerful story. That sets you up for success because you're setting a timeline of 5 minutes. And then after those 5 minutes, you transition into a story. And remember, your last words linger, so that story is what's going to linger, and you have to make it a powerful one. Now, when you tell your audience that there will be time for questions later on in the speech, you can also instruct them to write it down. And this does a few things. One, your audience will know there will be time for questions. Two, your audience has plenty of time to formulate the questions. And three, it gives your audience a heads up to not blurt out questions whenever they feel like it. And then to summarize, when it comes time to the actual Q&A, don't ask, but inform. In other words, don't ask if there are questions. Inform your audience that this is the time for them to ask questions by saying something like, what are your questions? Or I will take questions now. Another thing to consider when you're in the middle of your Q&A is when the audience asks a question, chances are not everybody in the audience will be able to hear the question. So it's always a good practice for you as the speaker to repeat that question so that you can answer it for everybody. And to summarize, never close with a Q&A, make it the second to last thing. Anticipate and quantify the questions, give a time limit for that Q&A, and also stay on topic and let your responses enhance what you have to say in your speech. You can play the question and answer to your advantage by taking the question and then posing it to the audience as a whole and trying to answer a question that the whole audience would have. Then lastly, let your audience leave fired up by your message rather than confused by your Q&A. End with a story, end with a quote, end with something powerful. And now that you know the importance of a Q&A, I encourage you to practice giving the Q&A prior to the end of your speech. Then end the speech with a powerful message. Your last words linger. And that wraps up this episode on the question and answer. And in the next one, you'll learn how to take your presentation from good to great through practice, practice, and more practice. That's all we've got for this episode on the World Class Speaking podcast series. Until next time, remember that becoming a great communicator is so important because it leads to greater impact, influence, and income. Thank you for listening and have a great day.